Hey, boss, and welcome back to ADHD-ish. I'm Diane Wingert, and today we're going somewhere that I've been wanting to go to for a while. We're talking about stimulant medication for ADHD, specifically what it is actually doing in your brain and what that means for you as a business owner. Now, before anyone starts composing an email to me about how medication is a personal choice, yes, absolutely it is. I am not here to tell you whether to take it or not. That is a decision between you and your prescriber. What I am here to do is to take a genuinely fascinating piece of new science and translate it into something that you can actually use, whether you're currently medicated, considering it, or are just curious. I want to be transparent about where I'm coming from on this topic because I think it's important. Before I became a business coach, I spent years as a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist. I diagnosed ADHD in hundreds of adults, and I made a lot of referrals to psychiatrists for medication evaluations. So I've seen this process from the clinical side, the assessment, the conversation, the prescription, and the follow-up. And I'll tell you, even in that role, I was working with the same incomplete framework that most people are still using today. So this research that I'm about to share with you just lands differently for me than it might for someone who's only ever been on the receiving end of a diagnosis. Because here's the thing. Most of the information floating around out there about how stimulant medication works is just wrong, or at least significantly incomplete. And when you're building a business with an ADHD brain, incomplete information generally leads to bad decisions and strategy. Bad decisions and strategy often lead to blaming yourself for things that just aren't your fault. And I have a real problem with unnecessary self-blame. So let's fix this. In December 2025, a major study was published in Cell, CELL, which, if you're not familiar, is one of the most respected scientific journals in the world, not a place where half-baked research goes to die. Researchers at Washington University in St. Louis looked at brain imaging data from nearly 12,000 kids, then validated their findings with a controlled drug trial in adults. And what they found turns a lot of conventional wisdom about ADHD medication completely on its head. So grab your coffee, your tea, or whatever gets you through the day, and let's get into it. For decades, literally decades, the story we've all been told about stimulant medications like Ritalin, Adderall, Vyvanse, and their chemical cousins is this. ADHD means you have a broken or at least faulty attention system, and stimulants fix it by acting on the attention networks in the brain. Logical, right? Clean narrative. The problem is, it's not really what's happening. This research team, and they had statistical power that earlier studies just didn't have, found no significant differences in the brain's canonical attention networks when people took stimulants. Yeah, you heard me. None. They were specifically looking for it. They had enough data to detect even small effects, and they didn't find it. What they did find is that stimulants are doing two main things, and neither of them is fixing your attention. The first thing is arousal. Stimulants make your brain act more like it does when you're well rested, not smarter, not more capable, more awake, more alert, more ready to engage. The researchers found that the brain changes from stimulant medication look almost identical to the brain changes from getting a good night's sleep. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. If you have ever described what your medication feels like as, I don't know, it makes me feel like a normal person, or it's like the fog lifts, that's not a coincidence. And it's really not even just a metaphor. Your brain is genuinely shifting into a more wakeful state. And it happens in ways that you can measure on an MRI scan. The second thing that stimulants do is affect the salience network, specifically the system that determines what your brain decides is worth paying attention to and worth working toward. This is where it gets really interesting from a business strategy perspective. So stay with me. Your salience network is essentially your brain's priority setting department. It decides, is this task worth my effort? Is the reward at the end of the work I'm doing enough for me to put in that work now? For a lot of ADHD brains, that system is running on a very short leash. It's very good at flagging things that are immediately exciting, immediately rewarding, or immediately threatening, but not so great at generating enthusiasm for things that are important, but not inherently interesting. I know if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you've heard me say this more than once. There's really only 4 ways to get an ADHD brain to sit up and pay attention, metaphorically speaking: interest, challenge, novelty, and urgency. See why this is important? So what stimulants appear to do is make mundane tasks feel more salient. That means more relevant and more worth doing. The researchers specifically mentioned math homework because, again, they first studied this in kids as an example in their paper. And I thought, just substitute quarterly taxes or updating your CRM or writing your SOPs. And suddenly this research is speaking directly to the entrepreneur with ADHD experience. And I want to tell you why the wrong theory about how medication works actually causes real problem for people in business. I've worked with a lot of clients who take stimulant medication, and I take stimulant medication myself. Now, some of them were already medicated when they started working with me, and some started taking medication during our work together. A lot of people ask me my opinion, which I freely give. Almost universally, the ones who had been told by their doctors, by the internet, by TikTok, by their own internal narrative that the medication fixes their attention ran into the very same wall. They'd have a day where the medication just didn't seem to be working. Maybe they were anxious. Maybe they were emotionally flooded. Maybe they had a shitty night's sleep, and they'd think, what's wrong with me? I took my medication. Why the hell can't I focus? Well, the answer, and this research helps explain it, is that stimulants don't actually upgrade your brain's cognitive hardware. They don't install a focus chip. They change the conditions under which your brain is operating. And those conditions are always interacting with everything else going on in your business and life. I had a client, I'll call her Marisol, brilliant strategist, had been medicated for quite a number of years, and she kept telling me that her medication just stopped working in the afternoon. She could get through her morning, knock out a lot of real work, and then the afternoons became a graveyard of good intentions. You know what we figured out together? Marisol was chronically under-rested. She didn't get enough sleep at night. So the research we're talking about today shows that stimulants are very, very effective at compensating for sleep deprivation. Your brain on stimulants and your brain when well rested look almost the same on an MRI. But that effect is finite. And if you are constantly running a sleep deficit and relying on your ADHD medication to bridge the gap, you may be managing well enough in the morning and hitting a wall by the afternoon. That, my friend, is not a medication failure. That is a systems failure. And the fix is not a higher dose. It's a different conversation about sleep. This reminds me of another client. I'm going to call him Derek. Derek was a high performer by any external metric, running a successful company, managing a team, incredibly strategic. He had tried stimulant medication, but stopped because he was convinced it just didn't help. When we dug into that, what he actually meant was he didn't feel dramatically different. He didn't feel the way he expected to feel based on the story he had been told from friends and family members who also took ADHD medication. Here is where the research gets really important. The study found that in people without ADHD who are already getting enough sleep, stimulants don't provide much in the way of cognitive benefits. They don't make you sharper, they don't make you smarter, and they don't make you more capable than you already are. Sorry, not sorry. The popular idea of stimulants as a cognitive enhancer for everybody, ADHD or no, largely not supported. The benefits are most significant for people with ADHD and for people who are sleep deprived. Derek was doing just about everything right. His baseline was high, so the medication didn't feel like a revelation. It felt kind of meh, but that doesn't mean medication wouldn't help someone else who genuinely has that deficit in arousal regulation and salience processing. Context matters enormously. Now, here's where I get a little personal for a minute, because honestly, I think I owe you that on this particular topic. As I mentioned earlier, I take ADHD medication, have for a while. And I want to tell you what it does for me and what it absolutely does not do, because I think my experience is a pretty good illustration of what this research is actually describing. Here's what it does. It makes the gap between I need to do this and I'm doing this significantly smaller. The tasks that used to require a really elaborate negotiation with my own brain, the administrative stuff, the follow-up, the record keeping, the things that are important but really not interesting, those are less of a battle. Not zero battle, less. You know what it doesn't do? It doesn't make me a different person. It doesn't replace strategy with spontaneous competence. It doesn't mean I never procrastinate, I never get distracted, I never fall down a research rabbit hole when I'm supposed to be sending out invoices. And it absolutely did not solve everything, which, if I'm being honest, is exactly what part of me was hoping it would do. I now call that the magic pill fantasy. And if you have ADHD, I suspect you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's that voice that says, maybe this will be the thing. The right diagnosis, the right medication, the right planner, the right productivity system, the right coach, that one thing that finally makes everything click into place, like the Swiss Army knife. But I want to be clear. That voice is not weakness, and it's really not delusion. It makes complete sense that a brain which has been working overtime to compensate for a genuine neurological difference would keep scanning for relief. That's not a character flaw, and that's not delulu. It is exhaustion looking for an exit ramp. But here's what I've discovered from my own experience, and what this research actually confirms at the level of brain imaging. There is no magic pill. There is a pill that does specific things through specific mechanisms under specific conditions. And when you understand what those things are, you can actually use it as the strategic tool it truly is, instead of having a fantasy that it's going to fix everything and being perpetually disappointed. Which brings me to the part of this episode that I find most useful. What that actually looks like in practice inside a business. So if stimulants work primarily through arousal and salience, not by directly upgrading your attention networks, then there are some very practical implications for how you structure your work as a business owner with ADHD. First, your medication is not magic. It's more like a dial. Think of your brain's capacity for sustained effort over time as a dial. Without adequate sleep, the dial defaults to a very low setting. Stimulants can turn that dial up, but you can't turn up a dial that's already at maximum, and you also can't compensate indefinitely for a dial that keeps getting pushed back down by not sleeping enough or chronic exhaustion. This means that sleep is not optional. It is a performance variable. Understanding the mechanism that your medication's efficacy is directly tied to your baseline arousal state might make it feel less like a lifestyle preference and more like I don't know, putting gas in your car or charging it if you've gone electric. Second, stimulants help you stay, not just start. The research found that one of the most consistent effects of stimulants is on persistence and task effort, basically sticking with something, not just initiating. This is huge for business owners because so much of what actually builds a business is the rather unsexy, non stimulating, repetitive work. Writing the email sequence, following up with the lead, recording the podcast episode that feels very routine by episode 20. And here I am at 309. Your medication is most likely to help you with the tasks that you'd otherwise abandon, not the ones you're already excited about, which means that the tasks you naturally gravitate toward, the interesting new project, the creative brainstorming session, the client call, those things may not need medication's help. The tasks where you need the most support are the ones where the drug is doing the heaviest lifting. So plan accordingly. Put the unsexy but critical work in the window when your medication is most active. Don't waste that window on the stuff that your ADHD brain was already interested in doing anyway. Third, salience can be engineered, and medication amplifies your engineering. I think this is the most exciting sentence in this episode. So I'm going to say it again. Salience can be engineered, and medication amplifies your engineering. Your brain on stimulants is more responsive to perceived task value. What does that mean? If you can find ways to make a task feel more meaningful, if you can feel more connected to the outcome, if it feels more urgent, your medication will amplify that sense of salience. Conversely, if the task feels completely disconnected from any reward you actually care about, stimulants may help a bit, but you are still pushing a boulder up a hill. This is why I always say that clear goals aren't just good business practice for entrepreneurs with ADHD. They are a genuine biological necessity. When you know why you're doing something and you feel the connection between the task and the outcome, you are literally giving your salience network something to work with. Medication can boost the signal, but there has to be a freaking signal to boost. I have seen clients completely transform their productivity, not by changing their medication, but by getting really specific about the why behind the task. Not update the website, but update the website so when the podcast interview drops next week, the people who look me up will find something that actually converts them. That specificity creates salience, and that's the condition under which your medication works best. And fourth, the it's not working conversation really needs to be a lot more specific. If you ever find yourself telling your prescriber that your medication just isn't working, I want you to come prepared better than that. Based on what we now know, here are some questions worth asking. If it's not working because I'm chronically sleep deprived and I'm using my medication to compensate, which is both unsustainable and masking a bigger problem, is it not working because I'm expecting it to make interesting work more interesting, when actually its strength is making boring work more bearable? Or is it not working on the tasks where I'm emotionally activated, anxious, rejected, overwhelmed, because medication doesn't regulate emotional flooding? That's a different mechanism. Or is there genuinely a dosing or formulation issue that needs a clinical conversation? These are 4 different problems with 4 different solutions. The research I've been talking about today can help you have a more specific, more nuanced, and much more useful conversation with your provider. I want to spend a minute on the sleep finding because it's just so important. I think it's the most immediately actionable thing in this entire study and in this podcast episode. It's also the most easily misused. The researchers found that stimulants can essentially rescue a sleep-deprived brain, making it look, even on a brain scan, almost identical to a well-rested brain. But they also found that for people who were sleep-deprived, they saw the biggest cognitive benefits from medication as well. Here's how I do not want you to use that information. Listen up now. I don't want you to think, great, I'll just keep sleeping 5 hours a night and let my medication handle the rest. Because the research also makes it very clear there are cumulative health consequences to chronic sleep deprivation that stimulants cannot and will not fix. You can trick your brain into functioning better in the short term. You cannot trick your body into not paying attention in the long term. So here's how I want you to actually use the information. You ready? If you have been blaming your medication, blaming your ADHD, blaming your own discipline for productivity problems that actually trace back to insufficient sleep, now you have a mechanism to point at. This is not about willpower. Your brain is running a deficit, and then you are asking medication to cover it. This is not sustainable for your brain or your business. The other piece of this that I find really useful is the permission it gives you to take sleep seriously as a business decision, not self-care and not an indulgence. If you run a business where your thinking is the product, and for most of my clients it is, then the conditions under which your brain operates are directly related to your bottom line. Full stop. Now, let's talk about what the medication is not doing, because managing expectations is, frankly, half the battle. And it's where the magic pill fantasy does the most damage. Stimulant medication, according to this research, does not increase your cognitive ability. Doesn't make you smarter. Doesn't give you abilities you don't already have. What it does is help you access the capability you already have under better conditions. This distinction matters because I've had clients who started medication and felt really disappointed. They thought it was supposed to make them freaking brilliant, and they already were brilliant. They were just unable to get out of their own way consistently enough to show it. Your medication is not a talent injection. It's more like removing sand from the gears. And also, and this is important, it does not fix emotional dysregulation. The salience network it works on is related to motivation and reward, not to emotional flooding. And that's something that a lot of ADHD brains experience. So if you take your medication and you still get absolutely leveled by a critical client email, that's rejection sensitivity, but it's not a medication failure. That is a different system, and it deserves its own attention. And it doesn't help much with tasks that are already intrinsically motivating. A lot of entrepreneurs with ADHD notice they can hyperfocus like a mofo on the things they love without any pharmaceutical help whatsoever. But that's not really medication working. It's your salience network doing exactly what it's designed to do, which means the medication isn't really necessary or maybe even helpful for those tasks. So don't use that as your benchmark, whether the medication is effective or not. Here's what I want you to walk away with from listening to me today. The old story, ADHD medication fixes your broken attention span, was always just a little bit too neat, and now we have solid evidence that it's incomplete. Stimulants work primarily through arousal and salience, not through rewiring your attention networks. They make your brain more awake, and they make tedious tasks feel more worth doing. For business owners, that translates into a few very practical things. Sleep is not optional. It is a performance input, and your medication's effectiveness is tangled up with it. Structure your day so that the unsexy critical work gets your medicated hours, not your exciting creative work. Build systems that explicitly connect tasks to outcomes you care about, because your medication amplifies salience, but you have to create it first. And when your medication seems to be underperforming, ask a more specific question than "it's not working," because that question really does have a lot of different answers. And again, the magic pill, it doesn't exist, But understanding the actual mechanism, the real, specific, measurable thing your medication is doing and not doing, that is genuinely useful information. Information you can build strategy, systems, and habits around. And building these things with accurate information, as it turns out, is exactly what I help my clients with. Thanks for spending this time with me today. If this episode was useful, please, please, please share it with someone who would benefit from a more clear picture of what's actually going on in their brain. And if you want to go deeper on any of the business strategy applications we talked about today, you know where to find me.